The sky above Manhattan was painted in cold shades of gray, but inside the towering office of Blake Turner, warmth was nowhere to be found. A man of steel ambition and diamond discipline, Blake sat surrounded by glass walls and gold-plated deals. His company had just crossed the billion-dollar valuation mark. The city hailed him as a genius. The world saw a king. But not one person noticed the broken man behind the empire. Not until that voicemail shattered the illusion. He had silenced. His phone, like always, attending yet another board meeting filled with claps, contracts, and champagne. When he returned to his private office and casually scrolled through missed notifications, he noticed one lone voicemail. Unsaved number, unknown name. His finger hovered for a second before he tapped it. A child's voice, small, shaky, and scared, spilled into the room like a storm. "Dad, it's me. I think you're my dad. Mom's in the hospital." She fainted again. "We haven't eaten in 2 days. I didn't know what else to do. I found this number in her drawer. I'm sorry, please help. I'm scared." The world stopped spinning. Blake's breath caught in his throat as the voicemail ended with a soft, muffled sob. For a moment, he thought he misheard. A prank, a scam, but there was something in that child's voice, a broken innocence, a pleading truth that pierced deeper than logic could block. He replayed the message again and again. Each time, the same chilling realization seeped in. This wasn't a scam. This was real. And the voice. It sounded eerily familiar. His heart, long frozen by years of business battles and boardroom betrayals, clenched in his chest. The words, "Mom's in the hospital and we couldn't afford food," replayed louder in his mind than any applause he had ever received. Blake Turner, the millionaire who could buy anything, had unknowingly abandoned the one thing money could never replace. He didn't wait for his assistant. He didn't call security or check his schedule. He grabbed his coat with trembling hands and stormed out of his glass fortress. He didn't even notice the city rain falling outside. All he could hear was that child's voice. "Please help. I'm scared." The cold rain hammered against the skyscraper windows like a ticking clock Blake Turner could no longer ignore. Inside the penthouse office of one of Manhattan's most feared tycoons, the air was thick, not with celebration, but with silence. The board had just toasted his latest acquisition. The press was calling him the Golden Hawk of Wall Street. And yet, something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the sense that something was off. His phone had buzzed 3 times during the meeting, which was unusual. Blake was a man who scheduled emotion out of his life. He ran his world like a chessboard, ruthless, quiet, controlled. But that voicemail, no name, no context, was the 4th buzz. And for some reason it made his chest tighten. He tapped play without knowing why. What he heard next sent a chill down his spine. "Dad, I think you're my dad. I don't know if this number is still yours. Mom's really sick. She collapsed today. They said she might not wake up. I couldn't find anything to eat again. I'm really sorry. Please don't be mad. I don't know who else to call." The voice was shaking, soft, breathless, as if it was being whispered from the edge of despair. Blake's hand gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, white-knuckled. His million-dollar office suddenly felt like a cage. The voicemail ended in a click, but the words hung there, echoing. A memory flashed in his mind. Not a sharp one, just a ghost of a woman's voice, one he hadn't heard in nearly a decade. The voice from a different life, a life he'd sealed off and buried beneath mergers and power plays. Could it be her? He opened the call log, heart pounding now, sweat forming at the base of his neck. No caller ID, no location, nothing. He played the voicemail again, this time noticing something else. There was a siren in the background, and something else, barely audible, but definitely there. The faint sound of a nurse's voice. "We need oxygen. She's crashing." His breath caught. Whoever that child was, he wasn't just scared. He was in the middle of something life-threatening. A real emergency. Blake stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. He didn't even notice. He burst out of his office, surprising his assistant and startling the entire executive floor. "Cancel everything. I need a car. Right now. Call every hospital in the city. Check for a Jane Doe admitted with collapse symptoms in the last hour." "But Mr. Turner, you have a press conference." "I said now!" The storm outside wasn't the only one raging. As he descended the elevator, the voicemail replayed in his mind. The child's voice, the cry for help, the haunting possibility that this wasn't just a stranger, this was his child, and he may have already lost them once. He wasn't going to lose them again. Miles away from the towers of steel and glass, in a crumbling apartment barely holding itself together, Eli, a boy no older than 9, sat beside a rusted hospital bed that had been rolled into their tiny living room. His mother, pale and unconscious, lay beneath thin, borrowed sheets. The humming of the oxygen machine was the only sound in the room, apart from the gentle creak of the ceiling fan that turned like time slowly slipping away. Eli's shoes were worn through the soles, and his clothes were too thin for the cold. But he didn't complain. He never did. He had been the man of the house since he could remember. His mother, Lena, had once been full of laughter, her hair wild, her arms always open, her heart too soft for a world this cruel. But that softness had cost her. She worked double shifts, sometimes triple, in diners and laundry shops just to keep the lights on. Still, they often went to bed hungry. Yet no matter how bad it got, she would kiss Eli's forehead and whisper, "We're rich in love, baby. That's the kind of wealth no one can steal." Eli believed her, until the day she collapsed while washing dishes. The ambulance had taken her away, the EMT asking if there was someone to call. Eli had frozen. He had no family, no neighbors who cared. He'd only ever seen a photograph of a man in a drawer, a man in a suit, a face his mother would sometimes stare at in silence before locking it away. One day, curiosity led Eli to dig deeper into that drawer. And that's where he found the number. A number labeled only as "if desperate." He hadn't understood what desperate meant until now. He borrowed a stranger's phone at the ER lobby. His hands shook as he typed the number. And then, the voicemail. His heart beat so loudly he could barely hear his own voice. "Dad, it's me." The words didn't even feel real. He didn't know if they were true, but somehow, something inside him whispered they might be. His mother had never spoken of the man, but Eli remembered her smile fading when his classmates talked about Dad picking them up. He remembered her quiet tears on Father's Day. And now, with her barely breathing, it was all he had left. When he returned home after the hospital discharged her with nothing but a saline drip and an apology, he sat by her side, still believing help would come. He held her hand and whispered stories to her. About the park, about the sun, about how he was going to get her favorite soup once she woke up. His stomach growled, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to eat unless she could. Eli's innocence was his armor. He didn't understand why people walked past them when they asked for help. He didn't know why the nurses looked at him with pity but did nothing. All he knew was that he had to be strong, like Mama said, and strong he was. He folded the one blanket they owned around her tighter. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, a child's quiet hope burned against the darkness. Somewhere out there, he believed, someone would hear his voice, and maybe, just maybe, someone would care. The Rolls-Royce sped through the crowded city, but Blake Turner barely noticed the blur of lights outside. His mind wasn't in the present. It had been pulled backward, years ago, into a past he'd buried beneath ambition and greed. As the voicemail echoed in his AirPods for the 7th time, something inside him finally cracked. The voice of that little boy wasn't just a plea. It was a mirror, a voice of a life he chose to leave behind. He hadn't thought about Lena in years. Their love had been quick, fierce, and quiet. Something real in a world full of transactions. She'd met him when he was still trying to make a name for himself, before the suits, before the empire. She was a waitress at a jazz bar downtown, working nights and studying nursing by day. They shared late-night diner breakfasts, whispered dreams, and silly plans. But when his startup got funded and the investors demanded he move to LA, he didn't even ask her to come. He just left. Told himself love was a distraction. Told himself she deserved better. Now, as the car turned down grimmier streets and the world of suits and skyscrapers faded behind him, Blake realized he hadn't just abandoned a woman. He'd abandoned a family, a child, a son, his son. The weight of that truth dropped on his chest like concrete. All the money, all the glory, every deal he had ever made, none of it was worth the sound of that boy's trembling voice. The car came to a stop in front of a building that looked like it should have been condemned. No doorman, no marble floors, just chipped bricks and graffiti-covered walls. The kind of place he used to walk past without a second thought. He stepped out slowly, not caring that his $10,000 shoes were soaked in slush. Inside, a woman was lying unconscious on a mattress that looked more like a hospital cot. An IV bag hung from a nail in the wall. And sitting right next to her, clutching her hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to this earth, was a boy, small, fragile, familiar, Eli. The moment their eyes met, Blake's entire world tilted. Eli flinched back at first, his face tightening with fear and confusion. But Blake raised both hands and crouched down slowly, tears already forming in his eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you. I think I'm your father." He hadn't said those words in his entire life. Not even once. But saying them now felt like exhaling a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Eli didn't move. He just looked at him, not with hatred, not even with blame, just a quiet, soul-deep exhaustion that no child should ever carry. And in that moment, Blake saw everything he had become and everything he had chosen not to be. The walls he'd built with pride, the fences made of money, the silence he convinced himself was strength, it all crumbled. He didn't cry often. He didn't know how. But right there, in that cold, broken apartment, the tears came without permission, not because of guilt, but because for the first time in his life, he saw what it meant to be a father. Not the DNA, not the money, but the choice to show up, to be present, to never let go of the hand that needs you the most. Blake didn't know how long he sat on that cracked tile floor. The CEO of Turner Enterprises, man of the year, power broker, investor god, now reduced to nothing more than a trembling man on his knees before a boy who didn't know whether to fear him or trust him. Eli's eyes studied him in silence, not with anger, but with something that hurt even more. Cautious hope. Like his little heart had been hurt so many times, it didn't know if it could afford one more crack. "I brought food," Blake whispered, his voice rough with guilt. "Hot food." Real stuff. Chicken soup, grilled cheese, even dessert. Eli blinked. His small hands didn't reach out, but they didn't pull away either. I didn't know, Blake added, lower now, as if confessing to a priest. I didn't know you existed. If I had... His voice broke. If I had, I swear, things would have been different. Eli didn't say a word, but then he did something that destroyed Blake completely. He stood, quietly walked over to the small duffel bag near the corner of the room and pulled out a wrinkled photograph. The edges were torn, the image faded. But Blake knew the photo well. It was the last picture he and Lena had ever taken together, before he left. Before he became someone else. She kept this, Eli said, so quietly it was almost a whisper. Even when we had to throw away all our clothes, she kept this. Blake's throat tightened, his hands shaking as he took the photo gently like it was made of glass. His face in that photo, it was younger, softer, still human. I used to pretend you were a hero, Eli added. When I got scared, I'd pretend you'd come save us one day. The words hit Blake like knives. I wanted to hate you, but Mama never let me. She said, maybe you were just lost. Blake buried his face in his hands, his chest heaving with a kind of pain he couldn't suppress. This was the cost of success, not just missed birthdays or forgotten holidays, but broken promises he didn't even know he made. When he finally looked up, his vision blurred with tears. He reached out slowly and asked, Can I sit beside her? Eli nodded. Blake moved closer to Lena's side. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale. She looked nothing like the fiery woman he once knew, but there was still something sacred in her stillness. He reached for her hand, fragile, cold, and wrapped both of his around it. I'm here, he whispered to her, even if she couldn't hear. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again, I swear. And then, the smallest shift. A finger, her finger moved. Eli gasped. Blake sat upright. Lena? Her eyelids twitched, then a soft, broken whisper. Eli? She didn't know he was there yet. Not Blake. Not fully. But she knew her son, and that single word, just one, was enough to tear the dam inside Blake completely apart. He clutched her hand tighter, kissed her knuckles like a prayer, and wept. Because in that second, in that broken, quiet, impossible moment, there was still a chance to make things right, a chance to become something more than powerful, a chance to be whole again. Billionaire CEO arrested in fraud scandal, millions. Missing. Turner empire crumbles as Blake Turner faces federal charges. But behind the flashing cameras, the courtroom drama, and the press vultures, something no one saw was happening. A quiet, invisible war inside a man who had just rediscovered what really mattered. Blake sat alone in the cold steel cell, not thinking about his money, his board of directors, or the empire he once ruled. He wasn't trying to save his name anymore. He was trying to save Eli and Lena. His lawyers advised him to fight, to deny everything, to stall the case and pin the blame on someone else. But Blake did something that stunned everyone. He pled guilty. Not because he was guilty, but because the only way to expose Mitchell's corruption was to bring everything down, including himself. The evidence Mitchell buried was hidden deep within the Turner infrastructure, inside private servers, fake shells, and offshore accounts tied to Blake's name. The only way to access them was by giving up every legal protection Blake had. So he did. He signed it all away. The cars, the mansions, the company. The reputation he'd built for 20 years, gone. No courtroom speech, no heroic declarations, just a pen, trembling in his hand, and a signature that said, "Take everything, just leave them safe." Lena, still recovering in a state-funded hospital, never saw the news in full, but she heard whispers, and Eli noticed something strange too. Clothes arrived at their door, groceries, warm coats, even the rent quietly paid off. One night, Lena found a small envelope tucked behind their broken mailbox. No name on it, just a note. "You're not alone anymore." Tears filled her eyes as she clutched the paper to her chest. She knew. No cameras. No glory, just a man, silently sacrificing everything he had for a family he could never replace. Blake sat on the bench of the holding cell, his hands still cuffed, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a cloud. Every minute felt like a year. The echoes of the past, the cries of regret, the ghosts of what he could have been, all pressing down on him. But somewhere in the chaos, in the cold, relentless night, Blake made a vow, a promise to himself. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. Not after the quiet sacrifice that had stripped him of his wealth, his power, and his pride. Blake Turner was a man who had been broken, but he would not stay broken. The first call he made after his arraignment wasn't to his lawyers. It wasn't even to the press. It was to someone who didn't need to hear the lawyer's jargon. Someone who only needed to hear one thing from him, that he was going to make things right. "Lena," Blake whispered through the bars, his voice strained with the rawness of months of regret. "I need you to trust me." It was the hardest thing he had ever said, knowing how much he had betrayed her. But in that moment, Lena's voice, soft but steady, came through the phone. "Blake," she said, "you've already made your choice. You've sacrificed everything for us, and I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I know this." Her voice cracked slightly. "I know that I have to protect Eli, and I know that you won't stop fighting for him." Those words cut through Blake like a sword. He swallowed hard, closing his eyes to push back the tears. She was right. He couldn't fix what had been broken, but he could protect what mattered most. The determination in Blake's heart hardened. No more mistakes. He wasn't just going to sit in a cell and wait for the world to pass him by. He would fight. Fight for them. Fight for a future where Eli could have a father who wasn't just a man of business, but a man who showed up. The next few weeks became a blur of legal battles, interviews with investigators, and quiet meetings with his remaining team, people who had stayed loyal to him when everyone else turned their backs. But no matter how exhausted he became, no matter how many times his lawyers told him it was hopeless, Blake remained focused. He stayed determined, pushing forward with one goal in mind, Eli. Late one night, after the last call had ended and the sound of footsteps in the hallway faded, Blake finally did what he'd been dreading. He sat at the small desk in his cell, took out a pen and wrote a letter, not to the courts, not to the media, but to Eli, his son, the boy who had always hoped for a father who would come back. "Eli," he wrote, each word filled with weight and sincerity. "I know I can't undo the past, and I can't make up for the years I've missed. But I promise you, every moment I've spent away from you, I've thought about you. I've been working to make things right so you never have to feel abandoned again. The world may be against me, but I'm going to fight until I can look you in the eye and tell you I've earned the right to be your father. Please don't ever doubt that. You're everything to me, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you know that." He sealed the letter and made arrangements for it to be delivered to Lena and Eli. The weight of the words felt like a final piece of his soul being offered. But more than that, It felt like the only thing left that mattered. Days later, the walls around Blake seemed to be closing in, but for the first time it didn't feel like a trap. He had nothing left to lose. But in the emptiness, he found something he hadn't had in years. Purpose. He wasn't running from the consequences anymore. He was facing them head-on, fighting not for his freedom, but for something infinitely more valuable, his family's future. The world forgot Blake Turner. After the scandal, the courts, and the silence, he became just another fallen titan, a name once spoken with envy, now whispered with pity. Headlines moved on. New scandals took the spotlight. His former partners rebuilt the company without him. The house was auctioned off, his accounts frozen, his name dirtied. But inside a small halfway house tucked on the edge of the city, Blake was doing the hardest work of his life, learning how to become human again. He started waking up before dawn, volunteered to clean the kitchen, took shifts at the shelter across the street. He stopped wearing suits, started reading stories to kids. Sometimes he even walked past the towering office building that once bore his name. No one recognized him. And honestly, he was glad. Because for the first time in years, Blake wasn't trying to be seen. He was trying to be good. But the regret, oh, Janie, the regret, it never left. It followed him like a shadow. Every time he heard a child laugh, he thought of Eli. Every time he saw a mother holding her son's hand, he remembered how many birthdays, how many hospital visits, how many sleepless nights he had missed. One afternoon, while unloading supplies at the food bank, he saw a little boy with dark curls and big brown eyes sitting quietly at the back of the room. Something about him froze Blake where he stood. Then a woman entered. Tired eyes, fragile walk. Lena. Blake's breath caught. She didn't see him at first. She was talking softly to the volunteers, trying to register for aid. Her voice trembled when she spoke. She was proud, trying to stay composed, but the cracks were showing. Blake heard her mention Eli's school lunches getting cut, rent overdue. Medical bills again? He stepped forward without thinking. "Let me help," he said quietly. She turned, froze. Her eyes widened, not with fear, not with anger, but confusion, then pain. So much pain. "I told you we didn't need anything," she whispered. "I know," Blake said, "but I need to do this." Lena stared at him for a long moment. "Why now, Blake? After everything? Why show up like this?" He didn't answer with excuses, no apologies, no clever speeches, just the truth. "Because I'm tired of being the man who ran. I want to be the one who stays." That night, Blake sat outside the shelter, the city lights flickering like fading stars. Eli came out with a half-eaten granola bar, looking up at him. "Mom says you're helping now," he said. "Even though you're not rich." Blake smiled sadly. "I lost a lot, buddy, but maybe I found the part I never had." Eli was quiet. Then he did something that nearly broke Blake's heart. He leaned his head against Blake's shoulder. No words, no forgiveness, just trust. The kind that doesn't come from money or power. It comes from being there when it matters most. Blake closed his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. Redemption wasn't a clean road. It wasn't public. It didn't come with applause, but it was real. And for the first time in his life, Blake Turner didn't want a legacy built in gold. He wanted one built in love. Blake stood in the small, cluttered courtroom, his eyes focused on the judge's gavel, watching it hover in the air, waiting for the final verdict. The room was packed, but it felt like he was alone. His mind raced back to the last few months, the desperate moments, the silent sacrifices, the long nights staring at the ceiling, knowing he was paying the price for years of neglect, and all of it had led to this moment. He could hear Lena's voice in his head. "We can't go back, Blake. Not to the man you were." He had made peace with that. This man who stood here today, the one in the worn clothes, the one who had lived through the pain of losing everything and everyone, wasn't going to leave the room the same way he entered. He was going to fight until the very last second, not for himself, but for Eli, for Lena, for the future he could still salvage. The prosecutor slammed his papers down on the desk. "We have irrefutable proof of fraud and embezzlement. The crimes were intentional. Blake Turner systematically misled investors, stole millions, and manipulated the system to his benefit. Your Honor, we ask for the maximum sentence." Blake's stomach twisted. The weight of his past sins pressed down on him, the darkness of his decisions closing in. He glanced over at Lena, who sat with her arms wrapped tightly around Eli, her face drawn but calm. She had stood by him not because she owed him forgiveness, but because deep down she still saw the man he wanted to be. He couldn't let her down again. But then, as if out of nowhere, there was a shift. A knock on the door. A man walked in, unannounced. A man Blake recognized instantly. Mitchell Graves, the man who had once been his partner, the one who had been behind it all. Blake's breath caught in his throat. Mitchell had disappeared when everything collapsed. But now he was back! The prosecutor's eyes widened. "What is this? Why is he here?" Mitchell stepped forward, his face grim, but his eyes locked on Blake with something that felt like regret. Something Blake never thought he'd see. "Your Honor, I need to confess," Mitchell said, his voice low but cutting through the tension in the room. "Everything Blake has been accused of, it wasn't him. It was me. I was the one who embezzled the money. I was the one who created the shell companies and the fake accounts. I was the one who manipulated the books." Blake's head spun. "You see, Blake was never the mastermind," Mitchell continued. "I've been working in the background for years, using his name, manipulating him into decisions that were never his own. I used him. I made him think he was leading the company, but all along, it was my plan." The room was silent. Blake's heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the moment he had never expected. The betrayal, the truth finally exposed. "Blake Turner didn't commit the crimes," Mitchell continued. "I did, and I've been running from my sins. But I can't keep running anymore." The prosecutor didn't know how to respond. The judge's gavel fell. "You're confessing to all of this in front of a courtroom?" Mitchell nodded. "Yes, and I'm willing to face the consequences, but Blake, he deserves redemption. The company he built, the people he helped, they all deserve better than what I've done to him. I'll stand trial for everything I've done, but please, Your Honor, don't punish him anymore." Blake couldn't breathe. The next few minutes felt like a blur. The prosecutor, stunned into silence, had no idea how to proceed. Blake's defense attorney leaped into action, arguing that the confession from Mitchell would shift the entire course of the case. But Blake wasn't listening. His mind wasn't on the courtroom. It was on Eli. It was on the life that could still be rebuilt. Lena stood up, her eyes meeting Blake's for the first time since Mitchell walked in. And in that moment, all the anger, all the pain, all the years of regret melted away. Redemption wasn't about the verdict. It was about how you chose to live after the storm. Blake knew his past would never be erased, but the future was still in his hands. He would rebuild, slowly, carefully, for them. The room was silent, the suspense thick, like a storm about to break. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice steady but compassionate. "Mr. Turner, I'm taking this new confession into account. The Charges against you will be reduced. But this is only the beginning. You've been given a second chance. I suggest you use it wisely." Blake nodded. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Blake stood there, his body shaking with the weight of what had just happened. He wasn't free yet. But for the first time in years, he felt something he had never thought possible again. Hope. Blake walked out of that courtroom with a new mission. Not to chase money or success, but to rebuild a life with the people who mattered. To become the man who, after all the pain and all the mistakes, finally stood tall, not for himself, but for his son, for Lena, and for the world that would watch him rise again. Blake stood at the edge of the park, watching as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the world. The weight of the last few months, the emotional and legal battles, the sacrifice, the guilt, all of it seemed to be fading with each passing moment. For the first time in his life, the world felt lighter, like the chains he had been carrying were finally slipping away. Beside him, Eli was laughing, running after a kite in the distance, his laughter filling the air like music. Blake smiled, feeling the peace settle over him like a long-awaited embrace. This was what he had fought for, and as he watched his son, his heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Gratefulness. Gratefulness for the second chance. Gratefulness for the woman who had forgiven him, for the people who had stood by him, for the opportunity to make things right. Lena walked up beside him, her eyes softer than they had been in years. Her face had aged, yes, but in a way that reflected strength, resilience, and love. "I see you've been thinking," she said quietly, a small smile on her lips. Blake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I've done. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness." Lena's smile deepened. She reached out, gently placing her hand on his. "Blake, redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being here, for Eli, for me, for yourself. You're not the man you were, and that's enough." Blake looked into her eyes, feeling the truth of her words like a weight lifting off his chest. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. He was finally doing the hard work of being a father, of being a partner, of being someone who could be trusted again. He took a deep breath and turned his gaze back to the horizon, where the sun was now dipping below the skyline. It was the perfect metaphor. The day coming to a close, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. And just like that, Blake realized he didn't need the fame, the wealth, the high-rise office building, or even the validation from the world anymore. What mattered now was the life he was creating from the rubble of his past. He was learning to live. The sound of Eli's excited voice brought him back to the moment. He turned just in time to see his son running toward him, kite in hand, his face lit up with pure joy. "Dad, look! I got it to fly all by myself!" Eli exclaimed, beaming. Blake bent down, catching his son's outstretched hand and pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Eli hugged him back, his little arms wrapping around his father, offering more forgiveness than Blake could have ever asked for. Blake stood there for a long moment, holding his son, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future slowly fading into the background. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more mistakes. But for the first time, Blake wasn't afraid. He knew he could face it, because the key to redemption, the key to healing, wasn't in erasing the past. It was in accepting it, in acknowledging the pain, and in choosing to move forward despite the scars. Blake turned to Lena, his eyes brimming with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Lena squeezed his hand. "You didn't give up on us, Blake. That's all that matters." The three of them stood together, watching the sun disappear behind the horizon. The world was vast, filled with possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Blake felt ready to face it, not as a man who had fallen, but as one who had learned to rise again. The journey of pain, regret, and redemption had brought Blake to this place, a place of clarity and hope. He understood now that the true measure of success wasn't wealth, power, or recognition, but the ability to rise above your mistakes and build a life worth living. It wasn't the end of his story, but a beautiful new beginning. And with the people he loved, Blake knew anything was possible.